One war created the State of Israel. The same war created one of the world's longest refugee crises. For Israelis, it became a war of independence and survival. For Palestinians, it became the Nakba, the catastrophe. Most people think the war began in 1948, but its roots began decades earlier with secret pacts, contradictory promises, and borders drawn by empires that no longer exist. By the end of this, you'll understand how that single conflict still shapes global politics today. The Ottoman Empire's collapse at the end of World War I left a power vacuum across the Middle East. British and French diplomats, meeting behind closed doors in London and Paris, sketched new borders onto old imperial maps. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the former Ottoman Arab provinces into British and French zones of control. Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq fell under British authority, while Syria and Lebanon were assigned to France. These decisions were not made with local populations in mind. They were the product of imperial calculation, secrecy, and rivalry. By 1920, the San Remo Conference formalized these arrangements, and in 1922, the League of Nations issued mandates that gave Britain and France legal cover to govern these territories. The British mandate for Palestine, in particular, was defined by a legal instrument that combined vague promises to Jews and Arabs with the practical interests of empire. The new borders ignored centuries-old patterns of trade, pilgrimage, and community. Instead, they created lines that would become the basis for future nationalist claims and future conflicts. The officials who drew these lines, Mark Sykes, François-Georges Picot, and their colleagues, did not foresee the consequences. Yet their decision set the stage for decades of dispute over who belonged where and who had the right to rule. The map they produced is still at the heart of arguments over territory and legitimacy. With the old empires gone, the question of who would fill the vacuum was left dangerously unresolved. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a declaration that would echo for generations. His letter to Lord Rothschild stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while insisting that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Yet, just 2 years earlier, British officials had promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca an independent Arab state in exchange for launching the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence described borders stretching west of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, a formula the Arab side believed included Palestine. British diplomats, however, later claimed Palestine was excluded, citing ambiguous phrasing and secret understandings with France. These dual promises were not lost on the people living under the mandate. Zionist leaders, drawing on the Balfour Declaration, built a network of organizations: the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund, and by 1929, the Jewish Agency. They coordinated immigration, land purchases, and self-defense, laying the groundwork for a future state. In parallel, Palestinian Arab leaders formed the Arab Higher Committee, rallying around figures like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to demand independence and resist land sales. Each side built its own institutions, schools, and militias, preparing for a future that could only belong to one. British officials recognized the contradiction in internal reports, referring to dual obligations that could not be reconciled. As both Jewish and Arab communities mobilized, the mandate became a battleground not just of territory, but of incompatible national projects. With each passing year, the diplomatic tangle hardened into social reality, setting the stage for an explosive confrontation neither side would accept as negotiable. The question was no longer who the British had promised the land to, but how two mobilized societies would contest its future, by politics or by force. In the aftermath of World War II, the world's attention turned to the fate of Jewish survivors stranded in Europe's displaced persons camps. The horrors of the Holocaust weighed heavily on diplomats in New York as the United Nations debated the future of Palestine. Behind closed doors, Zionist representatives and their allies lobbied with urgency, leveraging the moral outrage of recent genocide and the political leverage of superpower rivalry. Latin American and Asian delegations, once undecided, found themselves courted with promises of aid, trade, and diplomatic support. The United States and the Soviet Union, adversaries in most arenas, both pushed for partition, each for their own strategic reasons. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly gathered for a vote that would reverberate across continents. The tally: 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. That slim supermajority was enough to pass Resolution 181. The plan divided the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, allocating roughly 56% of the territory to the Jewish state and 43% to the Arab state. Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths, was carved out as an international zone, a city belonging to neither side. The numbers were precise, but the lines on the map ignored the tangled realities on the ground. In Palestine, the immediate reaction was not celebration, but dread. Jewish communities prepared for a fight, while Arab leaders rejected the plan outright, denouncing it as a foreign imposition. Violence erupted within hours. The partition vote, meant as a diplomatic solution, instead became the spark for civil war and the mass displacement that would soon be called the Nakba. The world's attempt to solve one refugee crisis had set the stage for another, larger exodus, one that still shapes the region's politics and identities. The question of whose claim would prevail was now a matter of force, not negotiation. By March 1948, the Haganah's High Command issued Plan Dalet, its blueprint for securing Jewish-held territory before the British withdrawal. The plan authorized brigade commanders to take control of key roads and settlements and, if necessary, to clear Arab villages deemed hostile or strategically important. Orders were explicit. If resistance was met, commanders could expel inhabitants and demolish homes. These written clauses would later fuel a deep divide among historians over intent and consequence. On April 9th, the village of Deir Yassin, just west of Jerusalem, became the flashpoint. Irgun and Lehi fighters, two right-wing Zionist militias, launched a pre-dawn assault, supported by Haganah gunfire. By the end of the day, at least 107 villagers lay dead, men, women, and children. The International Committee of the Red Cross documented the aftermath, describing bodies left in cisterns and a wave of panic spreading to nearby villages. The attack was quickly broadcast by Arab radio, magnifying the sense of terror and triggering mass flight from the Jerusalem corridor. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within weeks, entire Palestinian communities began to empty out, sometimes under direct threat, sometimes in fear of similar attacks. The momentum of displacement became self-reinforcing, as news of Deir Yassin traveled faster than the fighting itself. But why did this exodus unfold as it did, and who bears responsibility? Here, the historical record fractures. Benny Morris, drawing on brigade orders and operational reports, argues that Plan Dalet provided both cover and encouragement for local expulsions. Rashid Khalidi, by contrast, sees a coordinated strategy of forced removal, rooted in earlier Zionist doctrine. A neutral analyst points to battlefield chaos, panic, breakdown of communication, and the logic of war. The evidence remains contested, but the consequence is not. By the time Arab armies mobilized to intervene, the refugee crisis was already underway, reshaping the struggle from a civil war into a regional confrontation that would redraw the map of the Middle East. At precisely 4 in the afternoon on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood before a small gathering in Tel Aviv and read the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. The text invoked both ancient ties and modern tragedy, promising equal rights and a safe haven for Jews worldwide. As his words echoed across the city, telegrams sped to Washington and Moscow, seeking immediate recognition. But the ink was barely dry when the reality of war arrived. In the early hours of May 15, 1948, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, crossed the borders of the former mandate. Egyptian columns rolled north from the Sinai toward Ashdod and Tel Aviv. Iraqi and Jordanian units advanced from the east, aiming for Jerusalem and the Central Highlands. Syrian and Lebanese forces struck from the north, threatening the Galilee. Arab field commanders coordinated their axes of advance, determined to prevent the new state from taking root. Inside Israel's provisional command centers, Ben-Gurion and his generals braced for a multi-front invasion. The conflict had transformed overnight, from civil war to open interstate combat. The stakes were now existential, not only for the new state but for the hundreds of thousands already displaced. With each new front, the war's consequences multiplied, and the survival of Israel and the fate of Palestine hung in the balance. Yet, as Arab armies closed in, a new variable was about to tip the scales. Refugees streamed across borders in the tens of thousands, carrying little more than what they could hold. By the end of 1949, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency registered nearly 700,000 Palestinians as refugees, families uprooted from Jaffa, Lydda, Haifa, and hundreds of emptied villages. Makeshift camps sprang up in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank, transforming a temporary emergency into a generational crisis. For Palestinians, this mass displacement, the Nakba, became the defining trauma, a wound that shaped identity and politics for decades. For regional leaders, the sudden influx of refugees strained resources and fueled political instability, undermining monarchies and setting the stage for military coups. On the map, the war's outcome was frozen in green ink. The 1949 armistice agreements traced out the so-called Green Line, a ceasefire boundary that left Israel in control of about 78% of former mandatory Palestine. The West Bank and East Jerusalem fell under Jordanian rule, and Gaza was administered by Egypt. The Arab state envisioned by the United Nations Partition Plan never materialized. Instead, the new frontiers locked in the results of war, turning temporary lines into the starting point for every future negotiation and every new round of conflict. The questions left unresolved in 1949 still echo in headlines and peace talks today. Borders drawn in 1949 define today's flashpoints. Over 5.9 million Palestinian refugees remain stateless, while Israel's security is still contested on every front. The war's unresolved legacies shape every negotiation, every uprising, every future peace. History here isn't past, it's the ground beneath our feet. What endures is conflict.